Hello everyone, my name is Charlie and I've decided to set up this YouTube account to accompany a blog that I kind of write, the link to which can be found in the description below. So what's this kind of account going to be about? Well, as you guys know, we're living through a time of huge political and social change in Europe, and yet there's a remarkable consensus amongst mainstream media outlets on some of those kind of important issues. But for me, these media outlets, along with their friends in the political world, seem to fundamentally misunderstand or misconstrue some of these problems. So I want to do something to try and address this issue. And so these videos will try and dig a little deeper into some of the prominent issues of our time. As a disclaimer, I'm not totally unbiased. I'll tell you guys up front that I used to work for a Labour MP in the UK and I helped him get re-elected in 2015. I'm now living in the Czech Republic, studying towards a PhD in political science. So while I'm going to try and keep these videos as straightforward as possible, and I will endeavour to use everyday language, occasionally I will use technical terms, some of which may sound quite antiquated, but this is just because of the world that I live in. I read a lot of political philosophy from the sort of 1800s, so just have to bear with me on that. So without further ado, let's crack on to the main body of this video. I want to talk a little bit about the French elections, but not being French, I haven't followed the campaigns, and so I'm also going to try to relate what's happening in France to what appears to be happening in my homeland of Great Britain. So the first round of the French elections have taken place, and to no great surprise, Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron have reached the second round. Now, the newspapers might feign surprise, and some even may feign dismay, but realistically, the polls did seem to indicate that this might happen. And if you read newspapers or listen to sort of like the main news outlets, then this probably won't come as a huge surprise to anyone. But what do I mean by this? Well, I know that it's a bit of a cliche, but that doesn't make it any less true. The media have become increasingly right-wing over the last decade or so. On the left, we sometimes talk about this idea of the Overton window, the idea of shifting the terms of debate, which has happened, but unfortunately the window has shifted to the right rather than to the left, which obviously left-wingers wanted. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, it's the kind of idea that in any given situation, certain views are more acceptable than others. So in the 1930s, it was kind of widely deemed okay to be quite anti-Semitic. Nowadays, this obviously isn't the case. The window has shifted, and now we realise that this is totally unacceptable. And anyone who tries to talk in this way is either shouted down or probably more likely just simply non-platformed. These views are simply not acceptable. I make this point because I want you to understand that opinion leaders in society are sometimes able to shape the debate in the way that they want. So in the 1950s, realistically, did unreformed Nazis believe in the policies of Hitler? Presumably, yes, they did. But they were denied a voice in both the GDR and West Germany, and so support for their ideas waned and eventually became socially unacceptable. And the same thing can happen with ideas which are less extreme. If you look, for example, at the welfare state, it took 2 world wars, millions of lives, millions of veterans with life-changing injuries, but eventually the governments of Western Europe came to realise the value of creating a system by which people could have access to universal healthcare. And so in 1948, the NHS came into being. This was because of a shift in the language by both media owners and political elites. Suddenly it became acceptable to talk about universal healthcare and other, things like that, when in times gone by, these views would have been condemned as the loony left or idealistic minority or even possibly communist. However, hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, there was a certain level of debate, or at least a certain level of plurality amongst political and media elites over what to do about this huge problem. There was increased interest in ideas which had previously been deemed kind of totally unacceptable. It suddenly became okay to reference Karl Marx and his followers on, for example, the 10 o'clock news in Britain, which was pretty surprising for me. Inevitably, though, and to no great surprise, after a while, the media and politicians kind of calmed down and clamped down on this sort of like radical talk. There was simply no appetite for the kind of change which would have been necessary had we chosen to embrace the ideas and some of these changes. And so Marx once again became taboo, and all talk of preserving a status quo, of austerity or living within our means, and all over Europe were elected conservative governments who would allegedly manage our country's finances in a much more responsible way than the mad socialists who had come before them. Okay, so hopefully this has explained to some degree the way in which words and phrases which we use can be a useful tool in helping to shape public opinion. But okay, so what? Why am I talking about this, and what does it have to do with France or the UK or elections or whatever? Like I said, certain phrases become kind of commonplace. And we need to, I think, be very careful about how we describe certain groups in society. If you look at UKIP in the UK and the FN in France, they both have something in common. They are regularly referred to in the media and amongst our political classes, and frustratingly for me, even in academic circles, which I don't really think is okay, as populists. But for me, this is wrong. This is incorrect. The word populism sounds like a term that maybe a political snob would use to describe the views of people with whom they disagree. But it's also very close to popular. In your mind, if you hear something referred to as populist, why would that be a bad thing? It's what people want, after all, isn't it? But this isn't really correct. A more accurate description would probably be demagogue, or just a wild oversimplification. Just imagine the media for a second. Rather than referring to Le Pen and her comrades as populist, that word was switched to demagogue. Would this damage her popularity over time? Would people realise that voting for these people is just as unacceptable as the racist policies that they advocate? The big problem that I have with Le Pen and people like her is that they have identified a big problem, which is inequality and a reduction in life chances. Fair enough, but their solutions are not sensible. They won't actually help the people who are voting for them. So I had a little look at an electoral map, which showed sort of vague geographic areas which voted for Macron and those which voted for Le Pen. Similarly to Trump in the United States, these sort of same maps were made. Le Pen did well in both rural areas and urban areas with some of the most chronic social problems, such as high levels of unemployment, social deprivation, all these other sorts of things. And another interesting statistic indicates that Macron was more popular in areas with higher levels of educational attainment compared to Le Pen. Now, obviously, it's dangerous to draw too many conclusions from these kind of big data projects. I'm a little bit cynical about them, but because within subgroups, there are always variations and people vote for all sorts of different reasons, and it's difficult to know, obviously, why people vote in what way. But I'm going to talk a little bit about possible reasons that people maybe voted in the way that they did. And while I don't think that it's likely these people who are voting for people like Le Pen will actually get what they want. So firstly, I want to talk about Le Pen's urban vote. So according to the map, Le Pen and the Front National did best in districts where there was high unemployment and other sort of indicators of social deprivation. Le Pen talks directly to these people and talks about how globalization has left them behind, which is true. But the solution, some vague promise to restore the glory of France and other sort of vague proclamations or sentences. How exactly does she see this happening? The main reason why France, along with the old imperial powers of Europe, did so well pre-World War I and II was because they were able to exploit their former colonies. Resources were brought in relatively cheaply from places like Algeria and Morocco, various other colonial territories, which were then processed in France and sold internationally for a large profit. Who benefited mostly from this? Obviously the owners of the large industrial plants that are processing whatever it was. This is a situation which is unlikely to recur, in the sense that they probably won't be able to exploit these people in the same way. And so presumably Le Pen has some alternative plan. Maybe protectionism, which may work in the short term, but will unravel fairly quickly if the markets which France sells into, such as Germany and the UK, respond with reciprocal measures, thus cutting demand, which will lead to reduced production, which will lead to job losses, and so we're back at square one. The biggest problem with France and the whole post-industrial world is that jobs are simply not there anymore because of the increased role of technology and automation. Let's look at the example of phones. So in days gone by, telephone exchanges were manned by humans who physically switched the wires around in order to make different connections. These days, that process is in some way automated. The same goes for car production. While people do still build cars, the human labour time, and thus the humans required to fulfil that time, has been reduced because robots are able to perform some of the functions which humans used to do. Does Le Pen have a plan to address this? I would suggest not. Just like Trump, she can demand that cars are produced in France, and this may provide a small short-term boost in the numbers employed in manufacture, but she's kidding herself if she thinks that this can last. a vote for Le Pen and the Front National is not a vote to restore your job. It's a vote for continuing the status quo, because the Front National are not promising to actually change how the economy works. The same applies for both the Conservatives and UKIP in the UK. Neither of these parties will actually help you if you are toiling in one of these sort of insecure, low-paid jobs which at some point in the future might get replaced, because fundamentally they're not going to change the structure of the economy. They want business to operate with a bare minimum of interference from the state, which means that these companies will continue to strive to make as much money as possible. And the most efficient way for them to do so is to replace all human labour with automation, because frankly you don't have to pay a robot a wage. Only parties which are committed to long-term education and re-education are actually doing anything to address this issue. Your job wasn't stolen by an immigrant or a Muslim or whatever. You were effectively replaced by automation for the sake of efficiency and profit. Le Pen and other sort of demagogic leaders, they can promise to ban the burqa and all other kinds of, crazy, racist, not particularly helpful policies. But realistically, is that going to feed your family, or pay your mortgage, or your rent, or is that going to help put your kids through school? I would suggest not. Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Put comments in the section below if you have any suggestions, have any thoughts about what I've just said. I'm always willing to hear from people. So thank you very much for watching. Ciao.